Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining the Data Stewards Trends to Watch. And as already mentioned, this is the end of year session. So it will be somewhat different in the sense is that we're not just going to reflect on what happened this month or last month, but we're also going to take kind of a broader bird's eye view on what are some of the trends that happened in the space of data stewardship that might be important to reflect on. And as I said, we can also have a discussion at the end on whether that resonates, whether there are other elements that you would say this is actually something that is important to take notice with regard to how it impacts data stewardship and the practice of data stewardship as well. We're also going to have a little reflection at the end so that you can reflect on what is on the snowman's hat, which, of course, you had plenty of time to look at and can reflect on at the end. Anyway, as I said, this is the end of year, so we're going to look at what are some of the trends that impact the data lifecycle and also impacted data stewardship. And so for those who, of course, remember what we discussed during the Data Stewards Bootcamp, where we talk about the data lifecycle and the decisions that are made across the data lifecycle, we typically, of course, categorize that in a few moments. One is, of course, the planning moment, then we have collecting, then we have processing and storing, and then ultimately sharing, analysis, and use. And so I'm going to go very quickly because, again, this is kind of a bird's eye view of what happened or what are some of the trends that I think are important to take notice of what happened across some of those stages as well. And so starting with the planning stage here, I think, and this is going to be a theme, of course, across all the stages, is where, of course, Gen AI or generative AI is really changing how we go about planning, but also how we go about preparing data, how we go about analyzing data and what we need data for. And we see this also at the planning stage, because one of the big elements, of course, that Gen AI is capable of doing is really pattern recognition and is really making sense of large volumes of data. And as we all know, if we want to plan a data initiative, we really need to know what is already known, what is already answered to our question that we seek to answer. And I think one of the big breakthroughs in 2024 that has changed the way we go about planning is really the use of AI, and especially, of course, Gen AI, for systematic review, where you actually really can understand what is already known, what are some of the, what is the evidence that already exists vis-a-vis certain kinds of questions, so that you then also can better align what are the questions that are not yet answered, what are some of the orphan issues that still need to be addressed as well. And I think that's a real kind of change. And of course, this is not, anyway, just in 2024, but I would say 2024, and this is just a selection of some of the articles that we curated last year, well, this year still, we are still in 2024, that really gives an indication of rapid movement in the space of using AI for systematic review. And there's this one particular that you may want to look at, which is kind of Future House, where they have developed kind of WikiCrowd, which is really trying to rapidly do systematic review or literature review using AI as well. And so Gen AI can become kind of a partner in the planning stage. It can enable you to also understand what is already known and what is not known. The other one that is really rapidly becoming more mainstream and has been used more and more, both in terms for preparing data for instance, RAG models, but also understanding kind of the correlations between different entities, whether it's different data sets that you might have or different types of evidence that you might have, is of course knowledge graph. Again, knowledge graph is not new, but it really has picked up this year, mainly because, of course, knowledge graph is a way to actually create relationships, as I already mentioned, if you want to do, for instance, augmentation of data, but it also can be used for topic modeling. And as you might remember, one of the key elements as a methodology to identify what are the areas for which you need to formulate questions is, of course, topic mapping, is to really understand what are all the issues associated with regard to a particular topic. And that can also be done through knowledge graph. Now, specifically, Microsoft Research has done a lot of work on so-called graph rack, which, as I mentioned, is kind of the breakthrough with regard to retrieval augmentation generation. But GraphRack has really made knowledge graph far more accessible, I would say, in order to understand different relationships between different data sets, but also allows you to develop metadata about different kinds of data as well. So it's also in the planning stage a way to actually start understanding what data already exists, because knowledge graph can also be used for actually identifying data sets as well. And then the third one is really because, as you might recall, in the planning stage, it's also about who are the stakeholders and how do you engage stakeholders in order to formulate the questions. How do you understand what the public might think is priority with regard to particular kind of problems? If you're interested in, let's say, public health or mental health, for instance, well, what are some of the priority issues that they feel should be addressed? And you can also now, anyway, leveraging AI, but also leveraging new methods like the collaboration playbook that was released this week, actually, by the UK government, in order to engage stakeholders at the beginning of a data initiative in order to really understand what are their kind of priorities as well. Another article that we curated this year was the article with regard to how to engage public in science, which is similar, of course, as how do you engage public as it relates to developing data initiatives. And then the other element that is interesting there is that article here, which we will come back at the end as well, which is, of course, conversational swarms, which has become kind of a trendy topic to explore, which is basically where you do simulation of engagement by simulating with AI agents as if they are the public, right? And so there's a lot of conversational swarms happening. You have both where you only use AI agents, or you have conversational swarm where you actually really use kind of collective intelligence to understand what are some of the priority areas that needs to be addressed. So these are kind of at the planning stage. Moving on to the collecting stage, what we see here is, of course, a lot more discussion about consent. And again, this is not new. We've discussed this before, where consent is becoming a real issue as it relates to reuse of data for other purposes than initially collected. But also, anyway, it becomes a real issue when you start using data for training, for instance, large language models, because how do you obtain consent, and how does consent even become scalable when you really are looking into vast volumes of data that may require consent as well? And so this is becoming a key issue. And of course, as you know, at the Data Tank and at the GovLab, we've been working on complementary approaches vis-a-vis social licensing as kind of a complementary approach to consent. But as you can see, we are definitely not the only ones that are looking into that topic. And so last week, the Center for Information Policy Leadership published this a report, which is really about the limitations of consent, which basically goes into some of the challenges, especially within the European context, right? Because as you know, GDPR does require consent each time when data is being collected. But of course, how can you then start reusing that? How do you enable secondary use of data, especially important, of course, within the healthcare context as well? And so what they are focusing on is this concept within Europe, which is, of course, legitimate interests, right? Because as you know, there are some exceptions with regard to obtaining consent if there is a legitimate interest to reuse that data for other purposes, right? And so they are developing that issue. For me, it's really interesting because the question then, of course, which is what we have focused on as a social license, is then who determines the legitimate interest, right? And you still need some kind of, from my point of view, community engagement in order to embed preferences and expectations within that legitimate interest as well. Now, similarly, what has happened, for instance, in New South Wales, which is also an evidence brief that was released last week, they are actually really taking this notion of a social license further. And so if you're interested in how do you get, for instance, a social license for health data, their evidence brief is really interesting because it points to existing efforts on how a social license was established. But then there are others as well, like the other article that was curated this month, which is really about online consent, where actually they make the case that many are consenting and they don't really want to know, right? So it's kind of the right not to know. But then the question is, of course, would the system, yes, you can enable and protect their right to not know, but would the system be better if actually they knew that the data would be reused in alignment with a social license that was obtained through another means as well? And so this is kind of one big area in 2024, which I'm sure will become even more pronounced, but it is a topic that definitely impacts data stewardship as well. Now, related with that, of course, there is a lot of effort then to give control back to the individuals with regard to their data as kind of a mechanism to reestablish agency. Because one of the concerns with consent is, of course, is that it's a very limited agency to individuals to determine what and how their data is being used. And of course, now there's a lot of focus on kind of decentralized systems. This is just one article. I could have pointed to many other efforts, whether it's Solid, of course, the standard that was developed by Tim Berners-Lee, or whether it's Project Liberty that also tries to establish kind of a decentralized web where individuals are in control of their data. My concern is that that's obviously, how can you be against this? But the challenge is, of course, is that if you're in control, but then you cannot share that data, or the options to share the data and the conditions to share the data are still very limited, then obviously it remains kind of a half-baked kind of solution, which is why I feel like decentralized data engagement always needs to go hand in hand with more of a data collaboration infrastructure as well. And absent that, it's going to be very limited as well. Then we see also interesting developments happening at the level of crowdsourcing and crowd data. This is kind of one of the initiatives that was announced this month, which is the WhatsApp chat map, which is how you can actually embed WhatsApp within OpenStreetMaps, which is kind of a much easier way to then also include different types of data. And the real interesting part here is to really start thinking about how do you embed in existing infrastructure in actually data collection or data crowdsourcing, right? And so the realization here is that WhatsApp is a pretty well-established infrastructure. How can we start using that infrastructure to, for instance, annotate or to augment some of the data that is being collected as well? Now, the key challenge, as always with crowdsourcing data, is of course how do you increase quality? And there was also a lot of attention, as there was last year's, but also that will be kind of a remaining topic, is of course how do we assure quality of the volunteered geographic information? And that was one of the articles that we curated last year that went into depth as well. And then of course the big other topic is synthetic data and synthetic content, which becomes kind of all over the place. Some of you have seen my presentation on Google search, where if you do an image search these days, I would say about 40% are already AI generated, is already synthetic. And of course, this becomes a big topic. It also becomes a big topic for instance, knowledge commons like Wikipedia, right? And the question here is that how much of Wikipedia entries are going to become kind of automated and AI produced content? How is it going to be synthetic to a large extent as well? And of course, synthetic data also is being used more and more as a way to actually fill the gaps of data because, as we have discussed before as well, we are actually entering a data scarcity environment where where generative AI developers are lacking data for improvement of their data and improvement of their models. And so they need to get more data. And of course, one way to do it is to actually create synthetic data. Now, that, of course, leads to the other big concern, which is model collapse. And we discussed this already in previous updates as well, but I think this is going to be another big topic with regard to that was another big topic that emerged in 2024 is, of course, how do you actually make sure that the models that are being trained, and now if they start being trained on their own data, how will this lead potentially to model collapse or even more hallucinating kind of behavior as well. The other big topic with regard to data collection and anyway, the other big topic in general from a data stewardship point of view, and I think that's a really important data stewardship topic, of course, is of course new kinds of metadata standards. And so we've seen a few efforts to launch new metadata standards because, again, for AI, quite often you need more granularity on what was the source. Do you actually, is it actually in compliance with existing licenses? How do you go about quality, of course, because quality becomes a key topic. And I would say one of the big elements of the Gen AI age that we are in is actually really where quality of data has put front and center again, right? And that's also in the open data community, right? So now if the open data community wants to be part of the Gen AI kind of ecosystem, then quality is going to be kind of the main topic that needs to be addressed as well. And of course, that can be expressed through metadata, right? Metadata can basically indicate what is the quality or what's the provenance. And so this is the standard that was developed by the Data and Trust Alliance. Highly recommend checking it out. It has about 20 metrics to identify data provenance. And it is also becoming more and more kind of used by the industry as well. IBM is one of the members of the Data and Trust Alliance, and they actually did recently a study, I think it's on their website of the Data and Trust Alliance, on the impact of using the standard and the impact of quality data, which is, of course, again, part of the other movement, which is kind of data-centric AI, right? Which I already mentioned. But anyway, the study indicated that using the standard, which also means that they really had to triage certain data in terms of quality, increased efficiency by 60%. And so it shows that adopting a standard also has impact on efficiency and effectiveness of actually using data. And there's now a realization that it's not just about volume of data, it's really about being able to have high quality data that is well sourced, is from authoritative kind of sources and that kind of stuff. Then we go into processing and preparing. And here, of course, surprise, surprise, the big topic of 2024 was and will remain computational power, right? How will we actually have the computational power to leverage and to analyze all this data that we are either generating, that is either synthetic or that is now made available as well. And I think that's going to be the other key element with regard to asymmetry, right? As you know, a lot of the data ecosystem is characterized by asymmetries, where you have data asymmetry, i.e. data you need, you quite often don't have, someone else has. And how do we make access to it? We have information asymmetry. How do we know what data actually exist? We have agency asymmetry, meaning how can we actually make sure that communities are part of the conversation? But now, of course, we also have computational asymmetry, because there are only a few that actually really have the CPUs that are needed in order to build the models that can be made available. And that's going to be a big topic as well. Now, part of that, there is also a whole range of new lingo that has entered the data stewards field. Meaning nerds are kind of arguing whether data products is the same as data mesh or is the same as data fabric, and what's the difference. And remains to say is that, of course, there's a lot of excitement about data mesh, which basically is a federated architecture, meaning that within an organization, quite often it was very hard to understand who has data and how to provide access to that data. A data mesh is basically a way to connect different units within a organization with different data sets that might reside among other units as well. So it's kind of a distributed way, a mesh of actually understanding what data exists and what is made available. Then, of course, data products is really, and that also, by the way, has become kind of a big topic in the data collaboration space, where a lot of the discussion nowadays is really about you set up data collaboratives, not just to have access to data, but to be able to develop data products that then can be used for answering particular kind of questions, right? And so a data product is basically, it's basically preparing data in order to be able to be used for particular kinds of analysis, right? And I think that's another big topic that comes back, is that we don't need data, we need data products, right? And that data products are also the way forward with regard to potentially sustainability of access to data as well. And then data fabric is another one. It's basically kind of setting up the pipelines for accessing data and analyzing data. And so there's a lot of discussion whether, anyway, there is even need for distinguishing it. But I think from a data stewardship point of view, it's important to keep an eye on the space of data mesh as well, which of course quite often is then combined with so-called PETs and PPTs, right? And that's another report there that we curated actually at the beginning of 2024, was released at the end of 2023, but many of it remains valid. And of course, there was a lot of other documents and reports that were released in 2024, which really focuses on privacy enhancing technology or privacy preserving technologies, right? And I think especially differential privacy, and to what extent, anyway, can it actually be used, because it turns out to be not so straightforward. But also, anyway, synthetic data, which we already said is not just data that you generate for having more data, but it's also data can generate for preserving, of course, privacy as well. But pets has become kind of a key element, and also takes away some of the risks, of course, with regard to accessing personal data as well. Linked with that, of course, the big topic of the year, and that you see popping up everywhere, is, of course, sovereignty, digital sovereignty. Because within Europe, they are trying to come up with the Euro stack. India, of course, has its own India stack. It was a big topic during the G20 on data sovereignty, digital sovereignty, and we see, anyway, even digital sovereignty happening at the local level. And what does that mean? Now, all of this points to kind of basically competition from a geopolitical point of view on the one hand, right, where everyone tries to be less dependent on other stacks, or less dependent on kind of data that emerges everywhere, or protects their own data so that it doesn't leave the country, and that it can be used for their own kind of purposes as well. Now, clearly, sovereignty is a core topic. Unfortunately, from my point of view, it also has all kinds of traps. And that's why I shared this article again by Akash Kapoor that we discussed also at previous sessions as well, where he also identifies that, anyway, part of the traps is that, well, not everyone can claim sovereignty. I mean, if you're a small country that actually needs to collaborate, then, anyway, it's great to have data sovereignty, but you will be basically running behind, right? And so data sovereignty is also a way, quite often, a protectionistic way to actually limit access to certain kinds of resources by the large players, which I think is kind of a perverse element of data and digital sovereignty. And I always feel like, meaning it's kind of, anyway, I'm not so sure that data actually stops at borders or could ever stop at borders. So we really need to, anyway, start thinking about, anyway, how do we actually provide more agency to determine what happens with data, as opposed to claim sovereignty. The other thing with sovereignty is that it's really about top down, not really bottom up. And so that's why, anyway, if you look at the new normative foundations, one of course the principles there is not digital sovereignty, but it's digital self-determination, which is a whole different, from my point of view, concept that is more empowering. It's also less about dependencies. It's more about determination and really being able to negotiate how actually you go about things as well. Anyway, either way, this debate will, I'm sure, in 2025 be strong. And I think it's important to take stock that this is something that especially is important at the processing and at the preparing stage. Now, as to sharing, again, a lot of discussion about the need to establish urban data collaboratives. And I would say data collaboratives actually have become more important at the time of data scarcity, right? And so we see that actually there's an increased amount for calls to actually collide and connect data, including the creation of so-called public data banks. I've also, this is a recent article that we published where we actually took stock of recent uses of non-traditional data through data collaboratives as well. But I think data collaboratives clearly has become even more important, and I think are also being recognized as kind of the pathway forward, whether they call data collaboratives or data commons, which is kind of the term that is being used more and more, remains to be seen. But that's another key topic as well. Then in order to be able to share data, of course, you need to have data being made portable. And that's another key topic. And that's why I share this kind of OECD report that really has made the connection between data portability and innovation, right? And just emphasized the importance to really not drop the ball as it relates to data portability. Of course, within Europe, you have the Data Act that also, and you have other initiatives that try to advance data portability, but I'm not sure we are yet there in terms of easy flow of data that would enable both cross-border, but also intra-entrepreneurial kind of sharing as well. The other big topic when it comes to sharing, which from my point of view is going to become even more central in 2025, is of course licensing. And I think many have recognized that the existing, for instance, open data licenses, whether it's the open knowledge license or whether it's the Creative Commons licensing regimes, are not really up to the challenge when it comes to, again, AI, and when it comes to actually really sharing data in a way that is not extractive, right? Because that's kind of one of the key challenges, is that how do you actually provide access to data, but not in a way that then only a few grab it and then anyway monetize it, and then quite often sell it back to the data holders as well. And so what we've seen is a lot of movement in the licensing space. We have kind of the responsible licensing of AI, the RAIL licenses, which then not only focus on kind of the copyright issues, but also try to use licensing as a way to instill responsible use of AI. But then anyway, even Creative Commons has indicated, of course, that it's very hard to actually use licensing as a mechanism for embedding preferences. And so they've worked on this notion of preference signaling, where actually communities or individuals can signal their preference on how the data is being used. And again, this is an article that you can go to see what the lessons learned are. But I think the more interesting developments are kind of within the African continent, where they developed kind of the English African license for African language data sets, where they now have a distinguished licensing regime for languages that originate in data, which of course is a big topic, right? Because one of the big challenges of AI is how do we not only improve the quality of the data, but how do we also make it more culturally diverse? And given the fact that much of the Gen AI kind of environment is actually only really trained on a few languages, and of course, being like the African continent that has kind of anyway a huge cultural diversity in terms of language and other cultures, they of course need to start thinking about how to actually make that accessible, but then how to do it in a way that is less extractive. And so they've come up with this kind of own licensing regime as well. And then, of course, the other big topic is the spectrum of openness, which is always a big topic, and how do you enforce kind of a tiered approach of access to data. And the National Academies published this report, which anyway, again, I recommend because it's quite interesting on how they're thinking about accessing to a national data infrastructure that is tiered. And then the question, of course, how do you tier it? How do you establish permissioning? And so anyway, one idea is, of course, to have those kind of research passports. But anyway, the other example here is from the NIH, so the National Institute for Health, that also has come up with kind of a different access tiers. So you have a public tier, which is kind of open. Then you have a registered tier for only those that are registered. And then you have kind of a control tier as well. And so this is kind of a big topic that will, again, from a sharing point of view, is becoming more pronounced, which is kind of tiered access to data as well. And then, of course, anyway, data spaces all around, and also federated data infrastructures as well. Of course, as you know, Europe has adopted the European health data space, which is kind of the first data space that actually got recognition by the European Parliament and the Council. But we will see how far that goes in practice. But at least it's a start. And then the other one that I really thought was kind of interesting is kind of the federated data infrastructure for scientific use in Germany. That I think is really interesting because there it really goes into kind of federated access, right? So it's not creating a single data pool or a data space. They really have kind of a different approach, which of course, by the way, data space is also federated in principle, right? So it's not like a different, but at least it would be interesting to see how they go. But again, that's another key topic, key developments, a lot of experimentation in this space with regard to data spaces and federated infrastructures. Then when we go to the analysis, again, a lot of development informed by Gen AI or by privacy enhancing technologies like federated learning. A lot of initiatives now on how federated learning actually can be used to prevent some of the challenges of de-identification. So, which is basically federated learning where anyway, you don't really move the data to the algorithm, you do it the other way around. And I think that's kind of a topic that, especially in 2025, I guess is going to come back more and more. Not always useful, because there's a lot of experimentation and proof that, anyway, federated learning not always feasible because you actually do need sometimes access to the data in order to understand what the data set is. But then a lot of course, interesting development also on kind of complex science, which really can be enabled by AI, where, for instance, a city is seen as a complex city, and then you start modeling cities as complex systems as well, which I think is very interesting to go as well. Of course, the big topic is LLMs and how you go about developing LLMs. These are just a few articles and blogs. One was really thinking about, anyway, how do you build LLMs for the social sector, which is, of course, the big question is that, anyway, how can LLMs be used for instance, sustainable development goals? Really, I recommend some of the lessons learned there, which indicates that it's not straightforward. And again, it goes back to the computational asymmetry that exists, is that quite often you do need access to computational power. Sometimes you gain it, but then it's so expensive that it's very hard to sustain it. And how do you actually leverage that as well? Then anyway, there is some kind of trend around veridical data science, which I thought was kind of interesting, which is basically data science that assumes that the environment in which you operate is messy, right? And that you're really not, because when you develop models, you always make an abstraction of reality, right? Which might not be reality, right? And veridical data science really tries to push this understanding that one has to be careful in modeling and has to be careful in actually understanding the domain as a messy environment, right? And that you need to integrate that within kind of data science as opposed to just assume that whatever model you develop actually does reflect reality. And so this is the book that I would recommend that really tries to challenge the kind of data science as being, all right, they create reality. But if you don't start with kind of an approach that reality is far more messy than the model that you have developed, then that might also lead to better insights as well. And then the last phase, dissemination and use. And of course, here a lot of the focus is still on digital twins, of course. And so this is an article by one of the alumni of the Data Stewards Bootcamp, which focuses on how do you build a digital twin in a citizen-centric way. But of course, there are many more efforts as well with regard to digital twins. And of course, digital twins are not just relevant at the city level. They can be relevant at, anyway, the individual level, where you can have a digital twin of an individual in order to understand, for instance, better diagnosis of health conditions as well. But you can also have digital twins of any kind of system that you can make a twin of, which of course, again, goes back to the veridical kind of data science, is that, anyway, a digital twin might not be the real twin and it's still going to be never as complex as the real twin, like a city, for instance. And so we need to really take that into account. Then I'll also quote here another article by the National Academies that really was interesting from my point of view, where they look into how do you actually develop visualizations for public involvement, knowing that, of course, it's not just about coming up with insight, it's also going about how do you actually present the insight and how do you present it in a way that actually the public can be more engaged on the data that is being presented as well, which is a big topic that I think not everyone yet is taking seriously, but from a data stewardship point of view, is going to become more important. It's not just about, anyway, the first mile, it's also about the last mile, right? How do you go from insight to action? And I think visualization is a key element, similar as simulation, of course. And so there's a lot of effort in simulation as well. As already mentioned, there's kind of simulation with even AI agents that are trying to simulate how people would react, but actually by engaging with AI agents. And there's also a lot of simulation that is happening as leveraging Gen AI. The other big topic that I just put here, because it's also linked with kind of the last mile, is of course sandboxes. And I think there's a lot of focus on sandboxes at the first mile and sandboxes at the last mile, right? Sandboxes at the first mile means how do you have access to data to do experimental data science so that you know what can actually be done with the data. And then sandboxes at the last mile is where you then actually test out different policy responses to, for instance, the evidence that has been presented as well. And I think that is kind of another interesting development as well. So with that, I hope I didn't take too much time to just summarize 2024 in terms of key trends that were, from my perspective, interesting across the data lifecycle, from the planning stage to subsequently the kind of how do you generate action based upon the insight that is developed. But these are kind of, from my point of view, kind of the 5 key trends that I hope have expressed. So there are a lot of efforts to empower individual and communities in how data is handled. As I said, some call this data sovereignty, some call it digital self-determination, some are developing kind of the decentralized approaches. Some are also really focusing on how individuals and communities can actually be part of creating data sets through crowdsourced approaches. Then there is a lot of developments on increasing efficiency, effectiveness, and the value of data already collected, right? And of course, that goes about, anyway, data meshes, How do you actually, a lot of data is already collected. How do you actually make sure that the ones that need it know that the data exists and then can have access to it? It's also about data products, developing a data product so that the data actually can be used as opposed to sit there. Making data AI ready, big topic. Key question, what does it mean, right? And that obviously is linked to kind of the other big topic, data provenance that has become, and data quality that has become front and center, and the use of AI to democratize access and use of data, right? And I didn't go fundamentally here, but also, anyway, there's a lot of conversational chatbots that are being created in order to engage with data. But also, anyway, you can start using data, AI to synthesize and understand what is already known. Technologies and techniques to decrease the risk of identification, PETs and PPTs, as already referred to, but also federated learning, which is kind of part of the larger kind of PET environment as well. And then steps towards making access and use of data more granular. Tiered access is kind of one approach, data mesh, again, another approach, but also some of the understanding, of course, on who actually needs to have access is kind of a big trend as well.